CH17 screen recording, part 2, video 2. Originally, we started off with different assessments, and now we're going to talk about actual psychotherapy with children and adolescents. And so generally, the same type of psychotherapy techniques that are used with adults are the same techniques that are used with children. However, of course, they need to be adjusted and modified from the adult model. So the therapy techniques do originate from a lot of the same underlying theories that we've discussed: psychodynamic theory, humanistic theory, cognitive behavioral psychotherapy, and that theory. And so ultimately, they generally seem to look the same, except there, of course, modifications and adjustments are made. Now, the therapeutic alliance is just as critical between the therapist and the child, but also between the therapist, the child, and the parents. It is a system within that therapeutic alliance. So when we're working with adults, it's the therapist and the mental health consumer where you build the alliance. But in this case, you are building a systemic alliance where you're really working with children, their parents, even their siblings, even grandparents, anyone who is part of the child's life that may be important. Cultural competency is actually essential. So I want to take a little bit a side note on that one. So we do know that the culture of youth is very specific. We know that childhood and adolescence in and of itself is its own culture. It has its own set of beliefs, customs, ways of life, ways of being, the schoolyard sort of norms that exist with fourth graders versus ninth graders versus seniors. There's these different types of, expectations and norms, and it's its own culture itself. And so therefore, the therapist has to have a keen understanding of the youth, the child, and adolescent experiences within the context of their cohort, their ecological systems, as well as sort of their generation as a whole. And so what we do know, and this is very important to teenagers too and adolescents, it's not just that we understand as clinicians sort of the culture and vibe of children and youth and teenagers, but it's also very important for teenagers to see that therapists understand that. So for instance, one research shows that teen perceptions of their therapist's social media competency is strongly correlated with the therapeutic alliance. So if teenagers see that their therapists are aligned fairly well with technology, social media, and can understand that that's an important cultural experiences of children and youth today, then they are much more responsive to that therapist, and the alliance is that much stronger. Okay. Moving right along, cognitive behavioral therapy for children. Again, just some modification, but it has the same underlying theoretical ideas. It's empirically supported as a great treatment, particularly with children with anxiety disorders, but of course it's not the only one. But again, those interventions are adapted. So they do differ from delivery to adults, and usually they're adapted into games. An example of a game is something called Bravery Bingo. When a child has a phobic disorder, the child can earn like tokens and based on contingency management, these different incentives that can be placed on the bingo board every time the child successfully runs through each one of those exposures on that anxiety hierarchy. You've seen the anxiety hierarchy before. You've executed an anxiety hierarchy. So this is where a child with a phobic disorder earns tokens and are placed on a bingo board, the bingo bravery, as they move through the anxiety hierarchy. There's also reinforcement systems that get used here. Again, incentives are incorporated into homework, therapeutic homework, or tasks that, is a goal that the child would like to achieve, along with the support of the therapist, stickers, candy, privileges, and even just praise. Specific forms of treatment that tend to come through with cognitive behavioral therapy is a lot of social skills training and, of course, applied behavioral analysis. Applied behavioral analysis is where we're really trying to look at and understanding these children's changes in their behaviors, and it's heavily toward the behavioral side, where we're really giving incentives to complete tasks as well. Okay. When it comes to CBT for children, again, the two common types are social skills training and applied behavior analysis. I saved it from the previous slide because I wanted to go into detail here. Social skills training is Pretty typical that we use and start with, especially with children, attention deficit disorder, conduct disorder, right? Some of the other things that we just saw that were common childhood disorders that we should be concerned about, oppositional defiant disorder as well. The therapists teach kids behaviors that improve their interactions with others. So, for example, how to start a conversation, how to join other kids that are already interacting, because a lot of times these children don't know how to do that because the symptoms of their disorders are displayed first and foremost before even understanding how to have those interactions. So a child with ADHD, instead of saying, hey, can I play? They might come up to a group of young children that are playing a game and be disruptive in the game, stealing a ball, knocking over, blocks or something that kids might be building. It's Social skills training is very effective, and it works best when the child is not just explained, like given the social skills that they want to develop and it's been identified, but also given explanation of why they want to make those adaptations or changes, and also the benefits, especially if the benefits are meaningful to the child. With applied behavioral analysis, really comes from classical conditioning principles, the idea of reinforcement and punishment, shaping, extinction, right? There's a lot of evidence-based therapy for children using applied behavioral analysis who are on autism spectrum disorder as well. And ultimately with ABA, the child identifies and define specific behaviors or target behaviors. If the child does not have the ability to identify their own behaviors, perhaps they may be a very young nonverbal child that's on the autism spectrum. And so we might have a parent that helps to identify specific behaviors. So the goal is to really emphasize changing behaviors and really not just change those behaviors within that context between the ABA specialist and the child, but also to change those behaviors in any of those environments, right? We want to generalize the change of those behaviors to all these different environments as well. Psychotherapy. Okay, self-instructional training is a very good method. It is derived from the underlying theoretical framework of cognitive therapy, and it is a method that's best used for children with impulsivity and disruption. So, for instance, in other words, children that may be identified with or diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and children with oppositional defiance disorder. Now, the use can be expanded to other childhood problems as well, not only unique to children with ADHD or ODD. Another name for this is called a guided self-dialogue, because the child needs to understand that they sort of have to almost stop, identify the behaviors when they're crossing certain boundaries that are maladaptive, stop themselves, and then guide themselves with self-dialogue through a more adaptive approach to problem solving. So it really is designed to nurture problem solving and attitudes using cognitive strategies. Again, it's a form of cognitive therapy where the child learns to talk through specific situations. Now, the interesting thing is that this is a very structured, just like with cognitive therapy, it's a very structured approach with a step-by-step process. The first thing that happens with self-instructional training is that children hears instructions aloud, right, by the therapist, where they're giving them guidance and instructions about how to perhaps maybe even engage and with other children. If other children, use that as an example before, are already playing and engaging in an activity, that child needs to learn how to approach that situation without, stealing the ball or kicking over the blocks. So the child may hear instructions from a therapist and then gradually incorporate those instructions into their own thinking. The therapist then models the appropriate behavior, and it might be like, I see kids playing. I want to play with them. I'm going to approach them, and I'm going to ask them if I can play. So the child starts to repeat those instructions to themselves. And the key is really the therapist modeling the behavior so that the child can observe that. So the therapist would be up walking around. They might even have not necessarily another child in the therapeutic setting, but maybe they might be outdoors in a playground area, or perhaps they might have a couple of dolls that are playing and engaged, and there's a ball in between them. And so the therapist would be up walking around and demonstrating, I see two children playing. I'd like to play with them. I want to play with them. I'm going to approach them and walk towards them so that I can ask them if I can play. Meanwhile, the therapist is actually doing those actions. And so the therapist really guides, themselves into the behavior while talking out loud as well. Then the child tries the behavior themselves. And again, the next step of the process is the child trying it themselves with the therapist giving instructions, which be like, okay, you want to play with these children, go ahead and take 2 steps and walk towards the children and approach them and get ready to ask them if you want to play. And then after that, the next step of the process is the child would say those same instructions aloud to themselves. I want to play with those children. I'm going to walk towards those children so I can ask them to play. At the same time, they're doing the same behaviors. They're walking across the room to approach the 2 children playing with the ball. Eventually, after they say it aloud, the child will then whisper the instructions to themselves. And then ultimately the goal is for the child to be able to execute the behavior, approaching other kids, walking towards them, and get ready to ask them to play. And they have to do it silently instead of telling themselves what to do. And so this really does parallel the way that children would naturally engage and interact with others. So you always want to help them think about ways that they would naturally interact with others. And it is a really good form, right? And they start to take on some ownership through these self-statements. And it really allows them to behaviorally make changes based on their own internalized understanding of what they need to do through the process of self-talk and self-statements. It is a broader category of problem solving in CBT therapy for kids, but self-instructional training tends to be, yes, cognitive behavioral, but it does start with a very strong framework of cognitive therapy. Parent training is also very important when it comes to children, because remember, it's not just a therapeutic alliance between the clinician and the child, but that therapeutic alliance is with a system of people, parents, teachers, children. So parents are the primary agents of change, because a lot of times if we start to help parents understand their interactions with their child and how to guide their child through, some type of behavioral change, then it's going to happen much more effectively than if the therapist is working with the child alone once a week, once every other week, or a couple of times a month. So really the therapist's goal here is to teach the parents to use the same techniques that we might use. So based on conditioning and to make, behavior modification in their children. So we would then therefore train parents on these different behavioral modification techniques. It works very well with children with ADHD, conduct disorder, separation anxiety, school refusal, sleep-wake problems, just any other general sort of rule violations that might take shape within the household, not wanting to pick up toys, and the role here is just really 4 specific areas in this parent training. And it's usually identifying a problem behavior, that it's measurable and it's clear, and it really does identify the child's problem behavior, not necessarily what the parent thinks the problem behavior is, but really is the child's as well. Then followed by functional analysis. Functional analysis is really trying to understand, well, what are the contingencies? What are the incentives that would help this child to function or to modify their behavior in the way that is going to be helpful for them and the rest of the family, the parents, the siblings, as well as to generalize in the school setting as well. Also exploring consequences is important, right? In other words, what kind of things that can happen. Again, those contingencies and incentives. And they have to be established in alliance with the child, have to communicate those potential contingencies or consequences with the child as well. And, applying those contingencies, again, parents apply them at home. So if the child was able to do those things, then they would have positive consequences and they would get an incentive. And not only do they have to markate these on some type of a chart that a therapist would give them, but they should also report back to the clinician about the child's behavior using these objectives with clearly quantifiable outcome measures, and really having some type of a structured chart where we see these behavioral changes is very important, so we understand the changes that might be happening at home. They have to be measurable so that they can be visibly seen. Play therapy is very important. It is very unique to child clients and it's usually used with younger kids. And it allows a child to communicate with actions and any objects, their emotions, their feelings, thinking about their important relationships in their lives, as well as healing. So I want to take a look at these three areas as well. So the three basic functions of play therapy is really who are the important relationships so that we hope that they can go out into a playroom and they can pick and choose objects that seem to work for them or that they have an alliance to or they kind of have an affinity to. And they start looking at these relationships using puppets or dolls or action figures or even trucks and cars or whatever the toy might be. It gives them an opportunity to disclose their feelings and thoughts, and maybe even, for example, acting out their anxieties, acting out their fears, acting out through the doll what they're afraid of at night or when they get home or when they go to school. The third basic function of play therapy is healing, helping the child to learn coping skills or maybe even experiment through the toys and the objects with new behaviors as well. It can be very unstructured with the child given free rein to walk around in the playroom. And also, of course, cultural sensitivity has to be taken into consideration when a therapist is trying to understand the play experiences of that particular child. Outcome studies do suggest that the play therapy is generally effective, but of course, there can be some problems because we do rely on therapists' report to tell us how well it worked and the efficacy of it. However, that could be biased, and there are no therapeutic manuals for this, not like the way that we have manualized therapies for other approaches. And then moving right along, this is just this example of a play therapy room. And psychodynamic play therapy is slightly different than our general play therapy. It's a playroom with a lot of objects. The therapist is both a participant and an observer. And really, the psychodynamic play therapist takes note of, first of all, what the child chooses to play with in the room. And they interact with the child, but at the same time also monitoring his or her choices and actions. And based on that monitoring of what the child chooses to select to play with, as well as how they play with that, the therapist from the psychodynamic theory would infer the child's unconscious issues and then make the child become consciously aware of them. So they do these interpretations to help the child become aware of their inner mental processes. And that's the goal of psychodynamic theory with adults as well. So with humanistic theory, the approach is slightly different, but it is similar to psychodynamic play therapy, but there are some specific differences. Rather than interpreting the client's behaviors, humanistic play therapists tend to reflect their client's feelings, which can be, expressed indirectly through play activities as well. So really reflecting their client's feelings is important, observe and play along, and of course establishing that relationship where the child is completely accepted with true unconditional acceptance and genuine empathy is critical to the play therapy experience for humanistic play therapy. So how well does psychotherapy work for children and adolescents? Well, we know that behavioral treatments that we've talked about have an edge with children over non-behavioral approaches. Particularly CBT outcomes have consistently been positive. There's fairly strong efficacy, and best results are generally for anxiety disorders. However, CBT does produce fairly positive outcomes for children with oppositional defiance disorder, depression, hyperactivity, and even things at home such as school refusal, and maybe even some sleep disorders. Play therapy outcomes, again, are very beneficial for both externalizing and internalizing types of disorders, but there are some methodological shortcomings, particularly when we're looking at play therapy outcomes. As I said before, there may be some bias in reporting. But generally, successful behavioral techniques in the research literature talk about things from systematic desensitization, modeling techniques, cognitive restructuring, exposure therapy, response prevention, anxiety hierarchies, parent training techniques, just about everything that we've talked about have been very successful when it comes to psychotherapy with children and adolescents. Okay, and that ends our video 2 for chapter 17.